maybe we'll get started. So, again, today is the last lecture. So today we'll be talking about qualitative research methods. And if we kind of review what we've been going through so far, we've been going through different types of research methods and how you plan them and how you conduct them and so forth. And we've been mostly focusing on the lower part of this list, and especially the user experiment is one of the main methods that you might be required to include in your thesis. So that's what we've been talking about until last week. And today we're going to talk about upper part of this list, which is more focusing on qualitative feedback, and in some sense it's being a little bit more informal compared to the experimental studies. And although it could be also used in later stage of your research, such as summative or validation testing, in many cases these qualitative methods are more actively used in the early stage of your study, such as collecting user behaviors and user requirements and such of things, and to find the questions that you want to explore deeper in your research. So there is no, again, there is no right and wrongs with all of these methods. So you can choose from them, and always there is no one method being super important than the others. So always the better way is to try to mix and match some of the methods so that you can get a little bit more wider understanding of your problem or your question. So first we'll go with the interview and focus group, which is basically asking users. So if you have some questions you would like to ask, then just ask. So in comparison to survey or using questionnaires, this is verbally asking users face-to-face in many of the cases, although it doesn't require, in some cases you can do it over telephone or Skype call or whatever. You can also use those kind of online tools if you want to. So many of the cases, this interview or focus groups is used for understanding requirements or users' needs or problems they have in their under their context, so that you can collect them and apply it to your research. And in some sense, in some cases, you can also apply it to involve it as a part of your experiment. When your experimental sessions are done, you can do a small interview at the end of the sessions to dig a little bit deeper about what you found in your experimental study. And basically, interview is going one person at a time. So you're interviewing one person at a time. Focus group is more like having 7 or 8 people in a group, and not only asking them questions, but actually encouraging them to discuss with each other and to tell a little bit more interactively between the users, I would say.
That would be more useful for products.
Yeah, it would be, yeah. Focus groups are especially done by marketing people. They try to, when they have a new product and if they want to collect some opinion from the public or the customers, then they invite a group of people and do some focus groups. But still, you can still use it for evaluating your interface you've newly designed, or if it's at the very early stage of your research, you can merely use it for collecting user requirements and some background knowledge about your field of interest. So the pros and cons of interview and focus group compared to other research methods such as survey or experimental methods. The good thing about interview and focus group is it's better. It's good for understanding more details about the phenomenon, and you can go quite flexible with the interview. So if you have some questions that arises during the interviewing session or focus group session, you can involve those new ideas into there, so you can be quite flexible. The downside of it is it requires quite a skill to manage the interview or the focus group. So it's basically trying to get as much of information as possible within a restricted time by interviewing some people. So it's rather you will have to drive or lead the conversation within that focus group or interview. So it requires some skill and, of course, talking skills and so forth. And usually more on interview side takes quite a lot of time. So if you interview someone half an hour, then if you have 10 people, then it'll be about 5 hours you'll have to spend. And usually you'll have to schedule different people and you'll have to visit them sometimes. So it usually takes more time. And it also, but also the other downside of it is since you're asking the question out of the context, which means in experiment you usually just do the task and by doing the task itself, since you've just done the task, if you ask some questions, you can easily record what you've done. But if it's not not as a part of the experiment, then if the interview is done separately or independently, then the user might have to recall what they felt when they were using some interfaces or some devices. So could be so they might remember incorrectly or with some bias. So that could be also affecting the results you collect from the interview. But if you you can compensate it by like in focus group, you can show the interface before you start or let them get familiar with the subject and so forth. And so applications of interviews could be in different stages of your research. So in many of the cases, it's used for initial exploration to get better understanding of the topic or the field of interest of your research and find more detailed information about your research field. And also, similarly, collecting some user requirements so that you identify what are the requirements of your new interface design. And so these are mostly happening at the early stage of your research. But you can also involve it with the later stage of the research, such as evaluating your prototype. So you can do it alongside with your formal user experiment, or you can also collect some of the feedbacks from stakeholders through interview who might not be easy to get into your user experiment, such as ask some of the, if you're interested in some medical application and if you have to get involved with doctors, then it might not be easy to invite like 10, 20 doctors into an experimental session. So maybe interviews could be an alternative that you can use. So who to interview? So it's you can basically you interview most of the cases the users or the participant of your the users of your targeted users of your interface. But you can also interview other people such as stakeholders, such as your boss, or if you are developing a new product, then your boss or some people at the higher level of decision making could be someone who you can interview to know the intention or the direction of the product design and so forth. And it's basically anyone who may affect the use of your product or the design or development of your product. And to make the interview more richer, it's better to get your interviewees from various backgrounds. So not only to interview one certain group of people, but better to include different backgrounds, different people with different backgrounds at the different level of decision making, and so forth, so we can collect multiple perspectives of the problem to understand it more deeply. So interviews can divide into a couple of types based on how strictly structured it is. So there are basically three types of, we kind of categorize into three types, which is fully structured to unstructured studies and or semi-structured studies. And the less the structure you have in the interviews, it's more flexible. And you might, since it's flexible, you can also have some opportunity to, if you had some new ideas during the interview, you can involve or add them as you continue on with your interview. But but in that case, it is more difficult to conduct it because you'll have to manage it on everything on the fly as you go. And when you collected all those interviews, then since there is no certain structure, it's hard to collect certain themes out of it, and it's a little bit harder to analyze the results. So fully structured interviews, it's basically orally presented survey, which it means, if you remember the questionnaire you had, and you had certain number of questions and certain flow of the questions and certain way to answer those questions and so forth. So it's basically the fully structured interviews are basically having that set of questions that you want to ask, and then just reading out the questions and collecting the feedback through interview. And if you are doing a fully structured interview, then you'll have to stick with the script or list of questions you've made. And so that's how to do the fully structured interviews. So good side is it's easier to compare between individuals. So if you had a fixed set of questions and certain way of answering them, then you can easily collect them and compare between different interviewees you've interviewed. And of course, since you can easily summarize them with the structure, you can easily, it's easier to write them, write them into a report. And also, compared to questionnaires, it's easier to tell for your participants. It's easier to tell the answer to the question rather than writing it down. So in some sense, it's easier for the participants and makes it more relaxed. But the downside is if you have new ideas popping up into your mind during the interviews, if you are conducting a fully structured interviews, it's you should avoid adding new questions on the fly. Otherwise, you might create some differences between the participants. So it might get a little bit tricky when you try to collect them.
So what happens if, for example, while you're doing a fully structured one, and in the process of asking the participant asks you a question that's more related to what you're doing?
So you might have to plan for that in advance. So you might want to think of some questions that might arise from the interviewee. So you either address it at the beginning of the interview, or if it happens during the interview, you might better be consistent between the interviewees. So it's about planning ahead everything. But it doesn't mean that you will always have to do the fully structured interviews. In some sense, it could save your time, because if you plan it in advance and just go through the questions one by one, then that saves time. And since you can easily manage the time required for each interviewees and so forth, so it's about saving. In some sense, it's about saving time. And but it's again, it's not always that you have to do it in a fully structured way. Okay, so on the other end, other extreme end, there is an totally unstructured interviews. So you just have pick a couple of initial questions that you might be interested, and just let the conversation go between yourself and your interviewee. But again, since you don't have a strict plan or planning in ahead, it's a bit trickier for you to continue the conversation and get the details out of the interviewee. So it might require quite a lot of skill or experience to do the interview in an unstructured way. But it's good for exploration or investigating the topic at the very early stage of the study, since you might not have that much knowledge to list up all of the questions you want to ask, but you might be just learning as you go on by talking with the interviewee. So that could be also something to do. And of course, it's much difficult to analyze since the topics might go from one to the other, and then you'll have to collect them later on. As a middle ground, there's a semi-structured interview. So in this case, you have you plan some set of questions that you want to ask, but as you go through, if there's some new topics arises, then you can kind of branch off and then come back. But still, you might better cover all the pre-specified questions, so you can at least collect the questions from those pre-planned questions and add up with added questions on the fly. So interview questions, similar to questionnaires, you can basically divide it into two types of questions. One is close-ended, which is there is a certain form of expected answer you are expecting from the interviewee. So it's easier to analyze since if you ask for example here, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being best, how did you like the prototype? So it's quite similar to the questionnaire, but it's just asking the person. So you can also do those kind of things. Or did you like the prototype? That kind of question might come back with yes or no, or maybe, or not much, or some kind of limited number of answers.
What's the difference between the questionnaire and asking?
Could be the same results. It's more of like convenience. Like with questionnaire, you'll have to hand off the questionnaire, and the user has to read and write down by themselves. But this is more like interactive flow. So if it's a strictly structured interview, then it's basically there's nothing different between the questionnaire and your fully structured interview. The only difference is that you are reading the questions and collecting the feedbacks verbally, but questionnaires, in case you read and write, done by self-administered way by the subject. But again, interview you can go with more flexible way, such as semi-structured way, so that you can follow up with more questions, or such as if they answered one which was unexpected, and you can ask them why, or ask for a little bit more explanation, and so forth. And so that's closed-ended questions. Again, these type of questions are easier to collate or collect the results, since if you ask them this rating 1 to 10 questions, you can easily write down the numbers and take an average or median of the collected numbers and so forth. So easier to summarize the results, but could be lacking some of the details. So you might want to follow up with some open-ended questions, such as asking them to describe in more elaboration of the situation. So basically you mix up some close-ended and open-ended question. Close-ended question could be kind of summarizing the overall point of view in some way. So you can either put it in the beginning or the end, or it. So when you are formulating some interview questions, try to avoid long questions, especially when you are asking verbally. Then if the question is too long, then they might get confused. And if you are asking multiple things, then maybe separate it down into multiple questions and ask them one by one. And of course, try to avoid jargon. Try to avoid some leading questions that make some assumptions about users' feelings, such as why do you like, if you just ask straight off, why do you like this? Then you're assuming he likes it. So better ask some questions first, such as did you like it or didn't? And then you follow up with these kind of questions. And try to avoid some unconscious bias, such as gender stereotypes or cultural stereotypes. Try to avoid those. And also, same with the questionnaire design, try to avoid negative questions, since in some cultures, yes might be no, and no might be yes. And so you can see it's quite similar to survey using questionnaires, but being a little bit more flexible. And to prepare some good interview questions, if you're doing some project in a group, then you can brainstorm for good questions that you want to ask. And once you have extensive list of questions, then maybe you can group them into themes and order them, or split or merge them together and so forth. And always good to pilot test your question with someone near to you, so that you can, before you go out with actual interviewee, so that you can iron out some problems or misunderstanding with the questions and so forth. So once you have identified the questions that you might want to ask, then to prepare them, it's a good idea to have a kind of written down procedure, or so that you can actually follow them up. Otherwise, you might be a little bit lost when you're first starting some interviews. Then you might be lost without a written procedure. And it's also particularly good if you have multiple researchers involved with your study, so that if you're doing alone, then you'll have to interview one by one. But if you have your partners, then you can write down the procedures that you want to go through, and then can go in parallel. But in this case, you might have to make sure all the details are decided, so that might not introduce some bias or difference between the interviewer to the interviewees. And try to prepare how to capture the interview. So since it's the interviewees are giving feedback verbally, then you'll have to somehow capture that feedback, either writing it down or recording with audio recorder or video recorder. So you'll have to think of how to do that and how to prepare that. And especially when you are doing some recording, then make sure you have enough batteries or enough memory space and so on. It's kind of obvious things, but some cases you miss them out. So, and once you've prepared them and you started your interview, you're the host, so you try to build rapport with the interviewee. So try to be friendly and respectful, and the purpose is to listen their feedback, not for you to talk and instruct them. So try to listen more rather than talking. And also be careful of body language when you ask questions. So if your body language implies, if your interviewee gives some feedback and if you make some changes with your face expressions, then that might kind of make them feel a little bit different and might change their reactions, or might change their responses. And while you and once you've built some rapport, then once you are on the right track to start, and then maybe briefly introducing the purpose of the interview might be helpful for the interviewee to understand from what perspective he has to answer the questions. And of course, since it's a user study that involves participants, you'll have to go through kind of informed consent, and especially privacy could be an issue when you're recording them or so forth. And so make sure the interviewee is not hesitant about answering the questions because of the privacy issues. And it's always easier if you ask simple questions first and non-sensitive questions first to open up or make the conversation be, to flow, and then later on you can ask more details or hard questions later. And while during the interview, unless it's fully structured way you are really doing, you can be flexible. So try to keep things on track, but you can be flexible and sidetrack. But what you have to remember is, in many cases, interview takes some time. And you might have had some amount of time that you have arranged with your interviewee. So maybe try to keep things on track so that you won't end up missing like dozens of questions left unanswered. And again, if you have specific technical terms, then explain them to the interviewee in advance. And if you don't understand what they mean, then better to clarify it by asking them to rephrase it, or ask them if it's actually what you understand is what they've meant. And when you're doing multiple interviews, then try to be consistent between the interviews so that it will not have bias into one or specific interviews. And of course, you'll have to read between the lines. Sometimes if the interview says something, then it might not be exactly what it sounds like. So, but in this case, also try to not be guessing stuff. So always, if it's unless it's a fully structured interview, you can always ask to clarify if your understanding is correct. And capturing the interview, you can basically take notes of what you've heard, or do a video or audio recording. Taking notes, you can. The downside is you cannot write everything down what they say, so you'll have to somehow summarize them on the fly. So it might be a little bit tricky for you to do that. So you'll have to be quite concise when you're writing down the feedback, but still you don't want to lose the details. So maybe writing down some keywords quickly and then adding some details when you have time might be a good way. And in some sense, if you can, maybe you can have a backup with an audio recording so that you can go through the audio recording again and reflect what you've collected. Audio or video recording is more complete. You can repeat, replay it later on and so forth. But even replaying, it takes time. So if you did 1 hour interview, and then if you just relied on audio recording and didn't written down any summary of it, then later on you'll have to redo another 1 hour of listening through the recording. So it takes time. So it's always, even if you have an audio or video recording, it's always a good idea to write down some key points that you've heard of. And in some cases, if it's possible, if you have someone helping with recording, managing the recording, that might be also helpful. And you can also enrich the interview by not only asking questions, but that could be answered verbally, but you can actually ask them to do some activities to give more details, such as you can ask them demonstrate how to use the prototype. So if you have your prototype with you during the interview, then maybe you can give it to the interviewee and ask them to demonstrate how he does some stuff with your prototype. Also, you can ask them to show some artifacts, such as if you are asking them about some certain cases or certain experiences, previous experiences they had, then you can ask for photos or certain document or certain artifacts that might help you understand the situation. And also you can sometimes ask them to draw a picture or a layout of if you're trying to design a graphical user interface, then maybe asking them to draw the layout they think good might be also one way to add more richness to the interview. And of course, you can bring your prototype or some other types of props, such as if you're interviewing, if your study is about some mobile devices, then maybe you can bring your mobile phone and use that as a prop during your interview and so. And when you're trying to build more empathy or trying to understand more deeper about your user, then here are some tips. Asking why might be one of the good questions that you can ask more details about their thinking or their thoughts behind. You can try to encourage them to tell some stories about their previous experience with a similar case, or some stories that's related to your topic. And while you are doing the interview, if you find some inconsistencies, then that might be a good points that you might want to clarify or dive into more details. If that inconsistency is simply because of the change of the thoughts, or if it's there's some meaningful underlying logic under that, or so forth. You can, some cases, you can find some interesting insights when they have conflicted responses during the interview and so forth. And of course, try to capture nonverbal cues as well. So although it's better you yourself not to make too much nonverbal cues, but it's always good to capture the nonverbal cues of the interviewee, of course. And sometimes don't be afraid of silence. So sometimes, of course, being silent for 5 minutes might not be good, but on the other hand, don't be too pushy. So sometimes the interviewee might need some silence to to collect their thoughts and so forth. So a couple of seconds of silence. Don't be too nervous about those, and be flexible. So again, interview is basically going one interviewee one by one, and focus group is involving more people. So in some sense, since you're doing more people at once, it's taking less time compared to the number of people involved in the study. And usually it's around 8 or 12 people. So it's around not too many, but not too less kind of thing, so that you can have active involvement between the participants and conversation, but not too many people, so that some of the people might be left out in the conversation, or might be quite hard to manage all the conversation going on. So compared to interviews, focus groups, you can collect a broader range of viewpoints and insights in a relatively shorter time. And since it's not only you interacting with the participants, but the participants themselves interact with each other, they might get some insights from other participants and add up to that findings. So that's a good point with focus groups. And the good thing is, since you have more people and since you're not the only one talking, so you might be feel a bit more relaxed, and sometimes the participants themselves might be creating the flow of the whole focus group activity and so forth. But the downside is, in some sense, it might be hard to manage group dynamics, such as if there's a big argument or different thoughts or so forth, then you'll have to be a kind of mediator between them. So to keep the focus group on track, and since it's involving more than one person, it's usually you cannot be really fully structured, and it's not ideal to be fully structured. You might better go more flexible to encourage discussion between the participants. And of course, since it's more people involved and with a limited time, then you might not be able to ask more questions. It might be fewer questions you end up compared to the interview. And of course, and also inviting that group of people to one place at one time might be a little bit challenging with scheduling and so forth. And also, when you collect the participants, you might want to plan either to have homogeneous background of participants or to have different point of views and so forth. So it depends on your purpose of the study, but anyway, you might want to think of those details. Again, if there is some arguments or aggressions, then you will have to deal with them. So better to think of that in advance so that you don't panic when it happens. And since there are multiple people, and there's a high chance that some of them might be leading the conversation, so some of them might be left out. So in that case, you could ask questions to specific participants and addressing them by name so that you can get them a bit more involved in the process. And what if participants don't talk? Then you can, of course, you might have some list of questions that you want to ask. So try to have enough questions. But if they don't, it's also a good idea to rephrase the questions when they don't get what you're asking about, or to get more details about the question and so forth. And again, like the interview, you can use some props or some small gadgets to encourage people, and also one easy way to promote discussion is if someone says certain opinion, then you can ask the rest of the people if there is someone who agrees to that or who wants to add on that one, or if someone disagrees or have another idea about that, you can make a flow in that way if you want to. And once all these are done, both interview and focus group, you can do a debriefing, which is basically wrapping up with asking some final comments they want to say before finishing. And in some of the cases, if the topic you are dealing with involves some sensitive topics or some privacy issues, then might be a good idea at the end of the session, you turn off the recording devices and let them be more comfortable with giving you more sensitive information, so forth. And of course, and then once you're done, then you say thank you, and as soon as you are finished, try to summarize the notes and make sure all the recordings are in place. So once you're done, you start integrating the feedback. Do it as soon as possible again, and try to find common structures and themes and patterns from their answers and feedback, and identify some important ideas and which might have been repeatedly mentioned by the interviewees or the participants of the focus group. And to do that, there is a certain way to analyze those written feedbacks, and that's means that technique is called content analysis. And it's basically about finding common themes and structures and identifying keywords and patterns from the written feedback, or either written feedback or from a recording or so forth. So I won't go into much of the details, but there is a dedicated chapter in the book. So you might, if you want to do content analysis, and then that could be a good starting point. But basically, it's a systematic technique that you compress the written feedback into a certain categories of content, of keywords or themes. And the way you compress down into certain categories or keywords is called coding. So you're coding certain themes or patterns into usually one or a couple of few words. And to do that, there are basically two approaches. One is a priori coding, which is basically if the topic you are studying through interview or focus group is a well-known or theoretically well developed topic, then if you look into some books, then you might have some keywords already identified or well-known, so that you can choose those keywords when you're coding. But in many cases, this might not be the case with HCI, although you might have some important codings in your mind before you analyze it, but there might be some new terms or new patterns that you find out from while looking into the feedback. So defining the codes while you are analyzing is called emergent coding. And usually this involves multiple coders or multiple people who analyze content, so that you can compare between the two coders to make it consistent between them. And for some, saving time is an obvious benefit of it. So the way you do is first you, with multiple coders, you identify some coding categories or patterns that you want to look into. And then you first do a small subset of the data independently, and you come back with each other and compare how each of the coders did, and try to find if they are consistent or if there are some misunderstanding between the meaning of the pattern of the code, the coding, and so forth, and revise the list of the category or the code, and then do the coding independently. And then there are certain methods that measures the consistency between the two coding, and you can repeat the coding process until the consistency meets the certain target level. So while you're coding the text information, there are certain key items that you want to look into. So these are some of the examples. So objectives, actions, outcomes, consequences, causes, what caused that thinking or that problem, context, and strategies. These are some of the keywords that you might want to look into. And And these are some of the examples, such as if it's an action, if it's kind of websites, if you're evaluating some website and collecting some quality feedback, then there might be some cases where you're the interview is talking about entering password. Then if that's an important action to your study, then you can code them. Activity. And again, once you've coded all your feedbacks, then it's better to check the reliability. And there is, of course, it has to be reliable within the coder, which is if it's the coder himself or herself should be consistent between while analyzing the content. But also it should be consistent between the coders if there is multiple coders involved in the coding process. So you'll have to think of both of the consistency. And once you've coded them, then what you can do is group them or categorize them and report them in a way. And the good thing with coding is you can somehow pull out quantitative summary of the results. So, for instance, you can say 7 out of 10 participants said this type of topic and so forth. But while you do that, it's better to be as clear as possible. So when you are, and especially with coded content analysis, maybe it's better to give specific numbers, how many participants mentioned that thing, rather than saying just most of the participants mentioned this, so forth. And once you've provided summary of the feedback in this way, then you can add more details by quoting some of the interesting phrases from the interview. So in this case, this is about adding more details about their thoughts. So you can paraphrase what they said, and which is interviewee 1 said this, or interviewee 2 said that, and so forth. So you can summarize them too. So that's interview and focus group. So now we'll move on to case study and ethnography. We won't be dealing these two topics in too much details, but we'll just cover it as a kind of introduction of the concept itself. And I'll leave to you to read some of the chapters on the book if you go with this type of studies. So case studies is basically studying specific cases. So if you can't have a lot of number of participants that you want to address, then doing specific, a small number of specific, investigating a small number of participants or cases might be a good example of doing case studies. And in this way, you can get a little bit more in-depth, focused study of your case. And in many cases, it's mostly involving observation of your case. And also, you can also do some interviews alongside with your observation. And the focus is to have, one thing you might want to consider is to keep the real life context as much as possible. So unlike the other studies, such as interviews or experimental studies where you invite people or have a certain setting of the study, case studies are more about observation, so it's more likely to go into the context or the environment where they actually do the work or do the task, and then try to observe what they actually do in the real life context. And since it's a very narrow and focused study, and since you don't have many cases that you can compare with each other to generalize the results, it's always important that you try to get involved with multiple methods, such as not only observing what they are doing, but also introducing some interviews or some asking them to demonstrate certain things and sort of things, so that you can compare, even though it's within that case, you can compare different types of feedbacks and try to see if they match up with the others. And of course, in many cases, since it's about observation and interviews, it's mostly qualitative data you collect. So when you're doing a case study, could be applied for 4 main goals or main applications. So at the very early stage of your study, then these kind of case studies could be done for exploring the topic to understand the background and knowledge. So if you are doing a case study of a, if you are doing a research for an interface for an impaired person, such as visually impaired person or so, then at the very early stage, you might use this kind of case study as an exploration of how they do tasks in real life and what kind of problem they face and so forth. And also another goal or of the case study could be an explanation of certain task or certain phenomenon to understand it and create some model of that concept. And also, as a part of it, describing how the whole process or the whole system works, or whole process or the task works. And in some way, it's about documenting how. So during the case study, you might be developing some ideas and for design of the new interface that you might introduce. So recording the case studies, this might be providing some rationale behind why your study went in that direction of design, and so forth. And of course, another application or goal of the case study could be demonstrating or validating your interface you've designed. So you can apply that design or interface to the real world field. So for instance, if you have designed some kind of new AR interface for classroom, then you can deploy it to the classroom and choose a classroom and do a case study of that classroom using your interface, and so forth. So again, with case studies, as you can see here, although it's about focusing on a small number of cases, still you might want to think of what is the outcome or what is the direction of your case study you are heading to. Is it explorative thing that you want to understand what's going on with that case, or is it about demonstrating or validating your design and so forth? So you still have to have the research questions driving the whole direction of the case study. Some of the examples, again, some interfaces designed for disabled persons, such as visually impaired person, could be good examples. So these cases might not be easy to have a lot of people involved in your study, so you can do a specific focus on specific cases that you can have an access and so forth. But it's not only for medical applications, but could be also for widespread, if you are facing a wider range of audience, such as if you are interested in collecting feedback from all over the world, but not through questionnaires that might be superficial. But if you want to have more in-depth feedback, then you can do case studies from one country and another country and so forth. So that could be also another example where case study might be useful. So, and another type of qualitative study that's widely used is called ethnography. And this type of study is originated from anthropological study or social study, where anthropologists go when they find a new culture in unknown island or somewhere. What they do is they go there and get involved with them and live there. Try to understand how the social behavior or how the social practices are done. And the important point of this is to become a member of that group, so that you understand it from the member's point of view rather than outsider of a group. So
the observer would be doing case study.
So complete observer. So you can kind of have to have a balance between complete observer and going, so to say, native, totally being one of the natives in your group, because even though you want to understand it from the member's point of view, you still have to be somehow keep your point of view as an observer, or to say, be more objective rather than becoming too much involved with caught with their daily routines or sort of things, which becomes, if you become a native, certain things could become very obvious for you, but not to the outsiders, which you want to address, since the purpose is about understanding this group and explaining what's happening here. If you become totally native and you are not aware of certain things that could be interesting to the outsider, then that's not a good case as well. So you'll have to think of a little bit of balancing between the two. And again, if it's a complete observer, then could be thought of as a case study. But ethnography is, in some sense, a little bit more longer term study, such as spending weeks or months with that group and being immersed with that the group or the process. But case study would be more like arranging certain schedules with the participant and arranging and visiting them and doing some observation and interview within limited amount of time. So mainly ethnography usually used to understand how the technology or user interface or new design of your solution is accepted or used by the people. That is one of the main goals. The other goal is, if it's at the early stage of the development, again, it's about collecting requirements or needs of the users and understanding how they do certain things in the real world, and then later on trying to resolve or solve that problems through your design. So here's a comparison between the case studies and ethnography. So basically both are focusing on qualitative data rather than quantitative data. So it's mainly observation and interviews you do while doing case studies and ethnography. It's very personal and intimate, that you get very closely involved with your participants or target group, study group. And it also emphasizes on emphasizes on context or natural settings rather than inviting them to the lab or your office. It's about going where they actually use the technology or where they actually do their tasks and trying to get the natural settings. But the difference is case studies are in many cases still kind of you have a certain goal or theory or certain purpose of the case study. So it's more driven by that goal. But on the other hand, ethnography is more about being explorative. Once you've identified a certain group of people that you want to understand, you just dive in and try to collect and start understanding. So in some sense, this is more like, in some sense, it's a kind of inductive way of understanding things rather than being deductive with having certain goals to find out. And again, ethnography is sort of a little bit more longer term saying involving weeks or months and so forth. So some of the examples could be like if it's an interface used at home, then it might be your family or close family of yours, visiting regularly with them and spending time with them, and while doing that, observing how they use the technology or what are needs and requirements or problems they have, and so forth. Could be in work settings at certain, if you are developing certain IT system for a certain company, then it could be one of the employees or interns, or just be there and see how the workflows goes and understand the process and so forth. Same wise with educational settings, you can be involved with those kind of things. And medical application could be one thing you can do. But again, while arranging these kind of settings, you might also be careful of there might be some limitations with accessibility, such as medical application. There might be certain places or certain process that you cannot be involved, or sort of. So you might have to, in those cases, you might want to supplement it by doing some interviews later on with certain people, or so not to only rely on observation and your experience, but to be a little bit more active with asking questions to the people and doing some interviews and so forth. And also mobile systems could be a good cases that you want to do some ethnography. So like GPS, some of the studies mentioned in the book talks about a GPS system, in-car GPS navigation system, where they went on a trip. They followed a couple of group of people who is going on a trip using the GPS system and spending time with them and understanding how they do and so forth. But not only, and the last setting could be this kind of ethnographic study not only could be applied to physical environments or physical contexts, but could be in virtual contexts, such as if you're interested in understanding social networking systems or virtual environments and so forth, then you can get involved with the into a virtual environment, virtual settings, and then you.
How does that work?
Well, you can play World of Warcraft. You get involved with the players and.
So you just see how they play, like.
So it's becoming participating in the activity and observing how people do that, what kind of topics they exchange in an SNS social networking system, how frequently they log in and leave messages, how active they are involved, and so forth. And yeah, it's quite a lot. So that's it for today. So So we've been going through quite a lot of topics, and I think we spent more time focusing on the more formal methods, which is more likely that you might be doing for your thesis, but still, you can do other do more qualitative studies in parallel and use those kind of methods in your research. So there is nothing good or bad or right or wrong with choosing methods. It's always depending on what's your research question and what's your interest and what your focus is about. And again, you don't have to stick with only one single method. You can always use multiple methods and compare them and try to make your conclusion more general and more applicable to more consistent. And once you've done your study, the main point of evaluating your study or collecting feedback is to report them in your thesis or report. And the way to report is to try to cluster the feedback you've collected through multiple studies or multiple methods. And the main thing would be, from the HCI perspective, it's about what worked, what didn't, and what could be improved, and so forth are the main things that you want to pull out from evaluation or research. And we've been talking quite a lot about triangulation using multiple methods, different cases, and trying to compare them and make sure findings are not special cases and so forth. Okay, so these are the chapters that cover some of the topics we've covered today. And chapter 11, which is titled Analyzing Qualitative Data, kind of gives a bit more detail about content analysis. And I think chapter itself has some references that points to a little bit more details about the procedure that you do with the content analysis. But that's it. So that was what's on the evaluation stream of the lectures. So hopefully it was helpful for doing your researches, and hopefully it covered some.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Great. So hopefully you learned something useful for doing your research.
Yeah, I was just more focused on building stuff. Now I have to focus on
Yeah. So
I realize it's very important.
yeah. So both has different I would say values, but being more academic, it gets more involved. You get more involved with the research methods that because it's all about making conclusion and finding new findings and reporting it to the academic society. So. So, yeah. So you can always use multiple methods. Yeah, quantitative methods could give you kind of an overall view and a good summary of the whole picture, but it lacks of details. So you can add qualitative studies to add more details and different.
So what happens in research? Well, for example, if you're building a product and you went and you got a problem, you understood what the problem you're facing is, and then you went ahead, built the product, and then you brought it back to them to get their feedback based on that, and then they gave you some feedback saying, "Oh, what about this? What if you do this and this?" So you have a deadline because you're your research has a deadline, you can't continue forever. I don't know. Just how do you know about that?
Well, yeah. So it's easier if you do it in iterative way. So rather than leaving all the evaluation at the very end of your process, it might be a good idea that you have kind of incremental prototypes and try to collect feedback on the way as you improve your system or interface design. Yeah. So that could be one way to deal with it, and it's always a matter of choices, I would say, with a limited amount of resource and time. So in that sense, you might have to choose the right method that could save your time, such as if you are running out of time, then rather than doing more flexible type of study, such as unstructured interview or something like that, maybe it might be quicker to do a survey, could save some time. So you can choose different methods based on the amount of resource and time you have as well.
I was going to say one of the things that context on descriptive higher education, research diary.
Research diary, yeah.
Writing everything down you do.
Yeah. So diary, I think we didn't cover it here, but giving a diary is also one way to collect some feedback. So I think I've mentioned it, kind of. Yeah. So when you cannot really be there with them and observe them, what you can do is give them a certain diary that they can write them down every day, daily or weekly, writing down what they've done or what they found with the interface and so forth, and collect them later on. That could be also.
Yes, we could do the same though as well. As we're doing our thesis.
Yeah, if you journal your own research, then that could be a very valuable resource when you're writing down your thesis. So if you already have some ideas written down, then that could be a good resource for writing your thesis. Okay, so thank you for listening.
Afternoon tea.